Evening with a Legend is a series of presentations exclusive to legends of the famous 24 Hours of Le Mans, giving us an opportunity to bring a piece of Le Mans to you. By sharing stories and highlights of the big event, you get a chance to become part of the legend of Le Mans with guests from different eras of over 100 years of racing.
Tonight, we have an opportunity to bring a piece of Le Mans to you, sharing in the legend of Le Mans with guests from different eras of over 100 years of racing. And as your host, I'm delighted to introduce Charles Mendez, whose Le Mans resume is brief but memorable. He made 2 starts at the 24 Hours of Le Mans, first in 1980 with Racing Associates in a Porsche 935, and then again in 1981 with WM in a Peugeot P79/80. Both of which are machinery that embodied the privateer spirit of the era. Though he never claimed a class win or overall podium, Charles delivered a best overall finish of 13th and earned a class podium once, demonstrating consistency and resilience across 317 laps of competition. His Le Mans efforts sit alongside a broader legacy in American endurance racing, most notably his later role as a Sebring 12 Hours winner and promoter, making him one of those quietly influential figures who bridge grassroots racing passion with top-tier international endurance events. And with that, I'm your host, Crew Chief Eric from the Motoring Podcast Network, welcoming everyone to this Evening with a Legend. So with that, Charles, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you. It's good to be here.
Let's talk about your road to Le Mans. How did you put the deal together for your first attempt in 1980 with the Porsche?
Well, let me offer some context to frame that in, because it all kind of started in mid-1977 when Dave Cowart and I took over the promotion of the 12 Hours of Sebring. It had been teetering on failure for a few years. It had some rough times, and John Greenwood finally decided to give up his efforts at promoting the race. So David and I took it over, and during the 78 race, which was our first year promoting the race, I was fortunate enough to be on a press tour with Brian Redman and Dick Barber, because Dick was bringing 2 cars to the race, and Dick found he had an available seat in the second car and offered it to me, and I took it immediately. And this marked the first opportunity I had to be in a 935 and in a car and team that really had the potential to win or do very well in the race. So I kind of look at that as the beginning, although that's in retrospect. At the time, I had no thoughts whatsoever about going to Le Mans. It was just too big of a jump from there. But following that, I tried to buy a 935 for the end of the 78 season. I was not successful with that. Ended up taking an older 934 and a half and converting it for the 1979 season. And when I was at the Daytona 24 Hour, I met Alain Berthaud, who was the organizer or director of the 24-hour Le Mans, and we kind of hit it off very well. And he began to encourage me to bring my cars over for the 1980 race. As the year progressed, I was able to locate a factory updated 935 that Bob Aiken and I purchased in mid-79. We decided that we would have 2 cars to run the following year, and then those 2 cars would go over to Le Mans for the 24-hour race. So that's kind of the road to getting there. And I attribute a lot of that to just good fortune and some opportunities that presented themselves along the way.
So obviously you'd done a lot of racing stateside before this point, but had you turned any laps on any European track before heading to Le Mans?
No, not at all. Well, our first year at Le Mans, we just took our cars over and came back. In the 81 race, I did go over to the Nürburgring and ran that race, or a shortened version of it, in 1981.
When we look back at your very first trip to Le Mans, a lot of people talk about all the fanfare and what it's like when you get there and how it's like almost being on a different world compared to a lot of other racetracks. So what were your first impressions of your first trip to Le Mans, and what stands out most vividly as a driver?
I had 2 first impressions, if that's possible. In December of 79, I was on my way to Germany for the Porsche Cup awards banquet. I contacted Alain and he invited me to stop over, took me over for a tour of the track and for lunch at Unandier, which was very nice. But it's always interesting to see a racetrack like that that essentially is set up for one race a year. When you see it unclothed, because it's often quite different than when all the fans in there and the excitement and the cars and what have you. I experienced the same thing at Sebring when we took it over. I'd never been to the track during off season. It was shocking. It was in such a state of disrepair, but we got past that. We carried it along. My second first impression, obviously, was when we arrived for the race itself, and the crowd, the enthusiasm, the electricity in the air was just spectacular and overwhelming, especially starting off with the downtown tech inspection, which when you're there, you finally feel that you've become a small part, that is, of the history of Le Mans and such a great history.
If we talk about the American in Paris experience today, it's very different. Le Mans is a very global thing. It's recognized around the world. People tune in. They come from all over to watch the race. At the 100th, there were almost 350,000 people in attendance, not counting all the folks on television. But you come from the pre-Mulsanne chicane era, where there was a lot of different ways to be perceived as a driver. I've heard it referred to as a British race on French soil. I've heard, about battles and this and that. And we talked to some of the pre-Mulsanne chicane drivers about what their experience was like coming over to France as an American and racing with very few other Americans there. What was that like?
It just kind of fit in the overall scheme of things. And I say that meaning that I was so focused on preparing the cars and being there all together. I really didn't see it as anything other than another long distance race that we had to deal with virtually the same things. Yeah, Le Mans is different. It's got a long straight. It's a lot of high speed stuff. But in the end, it still was a long distance race that you had to address all of the challenges, which back then, unlike today, the cars had to be managed much more carefully because if you didn't, they often wouldn't hold up. Today, it's a 24-hour sprint race, and it's got 24-hour sprint racers driving those cars, so they never seem to let up for a second.
At that point, obviously, you had driven a lot of tracks in the United States, Sebring included. When you compare places like Sebring and Daytona to the pre-Mulsanne chicane configuration of Le Mans, what were the speeds like? Were you able to pull those kinds of speeds here stateside at Daytona and the Bowl, or is Le Mans just so totally different from those tracks you can't even compare them?
From the standpoint of the 935s, which drove mostly in the U.S., the top speed was probably just under 200 miles an hour, maybe just over, depending how you geared the car. With the Mulsanne, you obviously had a longer run, so you could gear it a little longer. Overall, we were running probably in the sub 200 miles an hour. Now, in the case of the Peugeot, that car, which was running a smaller horsepower motor, they had that thing geared and trimmed out. The car I drove would run about 220 miles an hour, and their lead car was running about 240. So they were top end terminal speed on the Mulsanne was just below the 936s, but still pretty quick. Now, I don't think they could have done that at Sebring because we only had a 1 mile straightaway, whereas the Mulsanne was 3 miles. That was kind of the difference. Daytona was a little different in that, you lost a little bit of speed in going into the second banking, but not a great deal.
So I want to pull on that thread for just a second, because if any of our listeners have ever done track time, you begin to realize that above 150 miles an hour, you start to get tunnel vision and things begin to blur and you become hyper-focused in a way. Le Mans is even more interesting because you're on a 2-lane country road where it's already very narrow and doing over 200 miles an hour. What's that like?
Well, you need to be careful. I didn't get enough time in the car in the 935, so I never really appreciated having that car there. But I guess I was so acclimated to it that it was so comfortable and came pretty natural. So it would have been very similar to Sebring race, which we ran on 300-foot wide airport runways in some areas, and then we're on just barely 2-lane roads that were in the interior of the airport facility there. So it took a lot of discipline in managing the car throughout that circus.
Let's talk about being a privateer at Le Mans. That isn't so much a thing anymore as it used to be. And even I think the last winning privateer team, we had Andrea Robertson on here, her husband and Dave Murray won with their private entry GT40 back. That was almost 15 years ago at this point. So let's talk about being a privateer in the 70s, where there were a lot of 935 entries. You were in that period where there were a ton of folks there. Being a privateer that presents its own unique challenges and you running a team, what was that like?
I don't think I ever looked at it from the standpoint of being a privateer as much as being kind of a rookie at the race, because this was our first time. We didn't have a lot of experience within our team. The drivers were all new to the track as well. That in itself was more of what was impactful, I thought, than the fact that we were a privateer. Porsche provided pretty good support to the 935 owners, maintaining rigs with parts for the cars and what have you. So it wasn't like you were totally out there on your own. In the sense of being the smaller guys racing up against the bigger guys is the way I looked at it. That's the way I characterized it in my head.
So obviously 1980 was a lessons learned kind of a year, which leads you to your road to your second attempt at Le Mans in 81 with the Peugeot. Talk to us about the good, the bad, the indifferent, and what your first attempt at Le Mans taught you and how that changed your approach to 1981.
Well, there were several factors in there. First, we brought over two cars, which for a first time there, I think is probably a little more than we should have taken off. I think we had more of an attitude of a holiday cruise than a serious race for some of the guys with us. We discovered some things that we didn't anticipate. For example, the trip over in the boat caused our wastegates to oxidize a little bit. And so we had to deal with that during practice. We lost a lot of important practice time. But overall, I just felt that we were maybe a little naive in going there with great expectations, but not quite being well prepared.
So why the switch from Porsche to Peugeot?
Well, I think you characterized it in your notes of the good and the bad. Well, if they say get the bad stuff out of the way early, that's exactly what happened to me. At the start of the race, it was raining very hard. Visibility was very low. I came together with a Ferrari, which I would say is his fault, my fault, didn't really matter. And on the way back to the pits, I was careful to get out of the racing line because I was fearful that if a car might come up upon me and he may have somebody following him closely, it was conceivable he could move over and the other car might come into me. I wasn't scared for my personal self. I was just more concerned with creating a problem on the racetrack. And as such, I got into the wrong side of the track. Stewards held me up there for a time to get me back into the pits. And in that process, I stalled the car. Our battery wasn't strong enough, couldn't get it restarted. My crew went up to Alain and said, can we appeal and have some dispensation to take a battery out there and get the car started? And he said, no, I'm sorry, the rules are the rules, and that's the way it is. That ended my race. Obviously, very disappointing. Great life lesson, how to deal with adversity when it hits you smack in the nose. After the race, Alain said he was very sorry, and he said, don't worry, he says, I'll make this up to you, which I had no idea what that meant. But I went off my merry way. My wife and I stopped in Paris on the way home and went back to the U.S. and lived with this very disappointing outcome for several months. And then towards the end of 79, I'd had a pretty good year in IMSA that year. I had a win, 2 seconds, 2/3, and first in class, second overall, because Peter Gregg always won. And I was lucky enough to finish second in the championship that year, so I felt pretty good. That year, Alain had teased me up in early 79 about bringing the car over. And obviously he was disappointed with my outcome, but he contacted me at the end of 80 and said, you will be getting a call from Gerard Velter, who owns the WM team. And I said, okay. This is December. The race is until June. And finally I got a call from him, and I think it was late January. And he said, Charles, he says, you will be at Paul Ricard on the weekend of March 21. And I said, oh my God, Gerard, I can't do that. That's the weekend of my Sebring race. And he says, I'll call you back. And I thought, my God, I just blew an opportunity to go to Le Mans. Fortunately, he did call me back. Said, you will be in Paul Ricard, and this was the end of April. They were testing their new car for Le Mans. They wanted to do a 24-hour simulation on the car and the motor primarily. And so they took their older car there, and I was invited there with a couple of the other drivers. And we ran, 2 or 3 days to get the time in on the engine and let them do the sorting there. But it was kind of interesting. I was not familiar with that area of France, and On my way there, I pulled off the interstate and asked the guard at the station there, I said, how do you get to Le Castellet? And he says, Le Castellet. He says, which one? He said, there are 6 Le Castellets. I said, oh my God. And it's midnight. I'm exhausted and a little discouraged. Anyway, after I found the proper address, I discovered that the owner of the inns had perished in an auto accident that very day. So they sent me off to another hotel. I forget the town, and spent the night there, connected with the Peugeot guys the next morning. Went to the racetrack. Things were pretty good, but they weren't very communicative with me. And obviously, they didn't speak English and I didn't speak French. So that was just a natural barrier. Finally, we tested a little bit that day. And that evening at dinner, there were about 15 of us there. And a buddy of mine had shown up at that point, and it was just icy. And it wasn't rude, but it was just icy. And finally, one of the fellows next to me, we started talking about where he was from, and he was from Beaune. And we started talking about wines, and we started talking about cheeses. And I knew the geography of France pretty well because I'd studied a lot about wines. And all of a sudden, that chilliness evaporated, and they were the greatest guys in the world. We had more fun together. And that continued all the way through the race at Le Mans.
Obviously, you had a lot of seat time in the 935 over the years, and you were at the height of the 935 period. When you talk about that relationship with that car, like you said, it was second nature. The speed was natural, regardless you're doing 150 or 200 miles an hour. But let's talk about the strengths, the quirks, the weaknesses of the Peugeot. I mean, it's a car that people don't even think about or talk about when you talk about the legacy of Le Mans, the Peugeot P79 specifically. So what was it like to drive? I mean, you did that testing at Paul Ricard, but once you got it out on the Mulsanne and you start turning laps with it, did you like it?
Of course, I liked it. Well, to be honest with you, I had not driven many other cars prior to that. And so this was an introduction to a purpose-built race car that was more in line with something like a 936, though not to that level, of course, or the Rondeaus, which were racing at that time at Le Mans. So for me, I had to learn how to drive a race car other than the 935. And that was a little intimidating at first because it wasn't the speed as much as it was the handling of the car was considerably different. You know, the last thing I wanted to do was create a problem for the team, which would be another X on Le Mans for me. So I was very careful with it. But just to give you an example, I came in after our first practice sessions and I asked the fellows if they could put a rear view mirror on the car, because you couldn't see out of the inside of the car that was blocked by the motor compartment. And they had a little silver dollar shaped piece of metal that would protrude through the plastic side window, which when you were at speed, that thing fluttered like a butterfly there so that you couldn't see anything there. And finally I said, look, I'm not a sissy, but I sure don't want to wreck your car. So they agreed to put a mirror. They put it on the right front fender, which worked perfectly well. I just needed be able to have some visibility on that side of the car. And the guys came back and recited to me how much drag coefficient that added to the car, which was detrimental to them because their car was trimmed out so well purposely for the Mulsanne. And when I say trimmed out, I mean downforce was compromised. Everything was compromised for top speed because that was a fairly small engine they were getting and small horsepower, relatively speaking, that they were getting, speeds well in excess of 220, 240.
To your point, the 935, you're constantly managing the back end of that. Older 911s are notorious for that, plus all the turbo boost that the 935s were making. I mean, I've heard them referred in very different types of adjectives of what they're like to drive. But you go to this mid-engine, lower-powered Peugeot that can do higher speeds down the Mulsanne. What was it like compared to the other cars that were out there? Because 1981, especially, you had Hurley Haywood in the 936, and you had a lot of other drivers there. Maybe it had some strengths over some of the other cars, but you guys just weren't able to capitalize on it?
Yeah, I think the comparison to the 936 probably a little more difficult. Our 2 lead cars qualified in the top 10, I believe, that year. We qualified about 20th. They were running much more competitively with whoever was running up front. Obviously, the 936s were and some 935s. So, I wasn't trying to compare myself to the top runners. Figured we were in a year older car. We weren't going to run up there, and we weren't there to prove anything other than bring that car home together and have a decent finish for the team.
And you know what's funny about 81, there's such a mixed bag of cars in there. Like you mentioned, you have the Rondeau, you have the Porsche 936s, you have the Peugeot. And I've always envisioned being able to ask someone like Marco Alain what it was like to drive one of the Lancia Le Mans cars. You competed against them. They were pretty much in your group of cars running together. What was it like to run against the Lancias?
I wasn't paying attention to them, to be honest with you.
That's fair. That's fair. I mean, they sort of bookended you. There was one behind you and one in front of you,
Yeah.
sort of in the pecking order there. So I was really curious because I've heard they were exceptionally twitchy and partially unreliable.
Yeah, we were running very consistently throughout the race till about 1:30 in the morning. We were bouncing around 13th or 14th place at the time. I was out on the course at night, right front steering arm broke on the car. I came in, we lost probably an hour in the pits replacing all of that. So it kind of mixed us up in the order till we finally got back to the end. I wasn't really keeping track too close to the cars we were running around because we kind of lost connection with them at that point.
All right, so let's talk a little bit more about the driving experience because obviously your second attempt, you guys completed the race. There were a lot more laps at Le Mans. Can you walk us through a stretch of the race where you particularly felt like on edge or you had to like overcome maybe mental stress or you were feeling fatigued? Like, how do you find the resolve to keep going when things get tough?
Things started off a little tough. About an hour before the race started, one of the mechanics came over to me and he was all excited. He motioned me over to the car and I looked inside the car and I realized he was pointing to brand new seat belts that had been put in the car, which the first thing that registered with me is that car was very difficult to adjust the belts in because they were attached way inside the monocoque. The mechanic was kind of puzzled by my reaction, but I got in the car and when I tightened the belts up as much as possible, I had about a 3-inch gap between the buckle and my stomach. I knew that an accident at speed in a situation like that would squirt you out of that car or through the roof of the car.
And these were the days before submarine belts too, right?
No, we had submarine belts, but still there was too much play in the belts there. And recognizing that I had very little that I could do at the time, I got a piece of hard foam rubber, which I put on my stomach to run the race with. And I basically put it out of my mind that anything was going to happen. Obviously, if you had that in your mind, you'd be a mess out there. But throughout the race, that proved to be fortuitous because, again, what we learned after the race, the rotors that were on the car were just slightly too big for the calipers. So the car was creating excessive heat coming in the car, which was a pain in the neck, but it was also creating excessive heat on the brakes. Throughout most of the track, that was not an issue because, the brakes weren't having enough time to really cool, but by the time you got to the end of the Mulsanne, they'd cooled enough to where the pistons had pulled back considerably.
Ooh.
So when you went down on the pedal, the first time the pedal went to the 4, and the second time you got it half up, and the third time it was back to where it should be. And the car, the way the pedal area was designed, it was very difficult to cross over one foot over to the other. And so what I had to do is after the kink, as I was going up the final hill there, I would slide down in my belts. I'd wiggle down enough to where I could reach the brake with my left foot so I could keep the power on, pump the brakes up so when I crested the hill and was down to the brake point for the Mulsanne, I'd have a full pedal of brake. So I drove the race that way, most of the entire race. If that doesn't quirk you out, I don't know what will, but it was fine. Once you adapt to those things in the car, things work. You figure out a way to work around a problem and you go with it. You mentioned the fact that we're running on street roads or public roads, especially on the Mulsanne. There were ruts on the road. As you'd move to change a lane to pass a car, to stay out of an approaching cars, the car would basically, and this car, the steering was so delicate. If you literally took one hand off the wheel, you couldn't hold the wheel in balance. It would develop a rhythm and it would begin to want to steer itself. But as you go over those ridges, and this was true for everybody, this wasn't just unique to this car, but the car would kind of jump from side to side.
Add to that, the nights at Le Mans are legendary. So if you were doing this in the middle of the night, that adds even more stress to the equation, right?
The nighttime, to be honest with you, the one thing I loved about Sebring, which really was my favorite part of the race, was driving at night. For some reason, I just found that the nighttime was peaceful and calming. There were obviously fewer cars around. I didn't find Le Mans to be much different, other than longer runs, higher speeds, and what have you, and then being in a car that was a little different. I won't say there was nothing wrong with the car. The car was quite capable.
1981's race comes to conclusion. A finish is a finish. It's better than not, as you said yourself, in not so many words. But why not another return to Le Mans?
A couple of things. Let me tell you one more story before we shift to that question, okay?
Fair enough.
With all the brake issues, with all the uniqueness of the car and, different environment, about 6 in the morning, I was coming back for my next stint and I saw a headline and a picture of the Calderson car, which was a Rondeau, which I think was Jean Lafosse, had crashed and been killed. And I looked at that and I said, man, you can get hurt in these cars. I said, let's put that aside for now. But anyway, after the 81 race, I decided that for several reasons that owning race cars was not really best suited for me. So I sold my interest in the 935 to Bob Aiken, my partner. I decided to basically just pick up rides where I could, which, I ran with Moretti a couple of times. In 81, I ran with some fellows at Sebring in 82 and 935 stuff. So it kind of worked out better, to further support that. In 1981, when I was at the Nürburgring, that was a year that Herbert Muller went off track, hit Bob Aiken's car. Both cars were totally destroyed. I mean, it was horrific. It was just absolutely horrific. That's when I realized I didn't need to be owning cars.
So, with that in mind, and not to talk about regrets, but if you could go back to that time period, knowing what you know now, is there a decision, whether that's strategic, mechanical, or even personal, something that you would do different?
If I could go back again with my car, I would do one car only. I would be much more focused on the preparation, pre-shipping, and post-shipping. I think after the fact, guys were flying their cars over rather than putting them on a ship. It took so much time out of the race schedule. I think I'd focus more on the car preparation side and just having, fewer drivers to deal with.
Charles, knowing what you know now, if you were talking to a younger driver that's coming through the system, I'm sure you've mentored many, and you relate your Le Mans experiences to them, what did Le Mans teach you, and what would you pass on to those new drivers beyond the result sheets, beyond all these other things? What piece of advice would you give an up and coming sports car and endurance racer that wants to go to Le Mans?
The world is so different today than when we were doing it. But I think what I would tell any young driver is that because there's so much competition for seats, if any of them were fortunate enough to get a ride that would take them to Le Mans, they're always competing, and if they don't perform, they're going to be replaced, So if they're not self-funded, I would tell them is never give up, because there are going to be periods when things do not go well, highly disappointing to them. Still doesn't necessarily affect, their quality or capabilities. They just have to take it in stride. So my advice is never give up and don't get too cocky.
And don't try to run your own team, right?
don't, don't run your own team.
So let's talk about the evolution of Le Mans. Obviously, you've stayed connected to it in some ways, obviously through friends that drove there, keeping up with the race every year, watching it on TV, et cetera, et cetera. But again, you were there during the pre-Mulsanne chicane era, and you've seen a lot of change in the track, especially in the 90s and then later, as the cars evolved in that. When you look at it holistically, what do you think of endurance racing today? And what do you think about all the changes that have come to Le Mans?
Le Mans and many other important sports car endurance tracks have changed, some out of necessity, some out of concern for the speeds, i.e. the double chicanes on the Mulsanne. They put a chicane in at Daytona, which I didn't think was necessary, but I'll give you a side story on that one. But the quality of the tracks today has improved so dramatically from back then. terms of the road surfaces, the curbing, the runoff areas, all the spectator safety, driver safety issues. Just very, very impressive. Couple that with the quality of the cars today in every class, the LMP cars and the prototypes, the GT cars, the GT4 cars. It's just the whole package is so far developed from that period of time. And especially since the 90s. I don't know when they put the chicanes in at Le Mans, but
1990.
1990. Okay. So the flying Mercedes in 99 was already with the chicanes in there.
That's correct. Yeah.
They did the same thing at Daytona. They rationalized that the tires were blowing because of a variety of reasons. So they decided to put a chicane in. And I spoke with Leo Mel about that after the chicane. And I said, Leo, I've thought about this for a long, long time. And I have no say in the matter, but I personally felt that the tire failures were a result that the tire could not take the downforce and the speeds of the 935s. He laughs and he says, well, we couldn't say that.
Mark Raffoff did when he was here, so he legitimizes what you're saying.
Yeah. So anyway, I figured that Goodyear didn't want to go through a whole development cycle on tires for 935s, figuring that they were going to last too long, and NASCAR was the name of the game, and the NASCAR tire should work, and blah blah blah. This is my personal aside, nothing to do with anybody or anything they've said, but I thought they just didn't see the return on investment for that, which was a shame because I think running the full oval at Daytona was really pretty cool.
Daytona didn't have the luxury of blaming Jody Scheckter like Watkins Glen did for their chicane nonsense that they put in, but that's okay.
Was it Jody's deal? I thought it was this other fella, Tommy Kendall,
Tommy Kendall had a bad wreck there too, yes, but they called it the Scheckter chicane because Jody complained they needed to bring the speeds down, and this predates Tommy's big wreck in the 90s. That was like 1994-ish time frame. But I bring that up just as an aside there. But I did want to talk about something else from your perspective, looking back and talking about the changes at Le Mans. For a long time, fans of both sports car and endurance racing and Formula One kind of go head to head as who's really the most technologically advanced, who is the pinnacle of motorsport. And obviously this year's Formula One, we won't make any comments about that. But from your perspective, having lived the sports car and endurance life, do you think there's parity now, or do you think sports car and endurance racing, especially at races like Le Mans, Spa 24, Nürburgring, and things like that, they've kind of edged out the technology curve that Formula One was holding?
I don't know. I mean, obviously, this year they're having a bit of a struggle with whatever the technology development is or for. I think it's more of the quality of cars that you see in endurance racing today is so advanced from where it was years ago, a long time ago. And, where you thought of Formula One as being the epitome of development. And never in the sports car world, but in the sports car world today, you see some pretty advanced stuff there. I hope they don't get too far ahead of themselves because the racing is very good. And I think the fact that the racing is good, you get a full 24-hour race today as a spectator, that I think that has appealed to the crowds and has helped support the growth in the crowds. I see it at Sebring. They had a record year this year. I'm sure Le Mans had a record year. But I don't know. I never got lost in those battles. I'm from the USA. The US, it's like NASCAR is trying to be better than somebody else. And, it's like, oh, come on, give us a break.
Well, there is a new development outside of all the facilities changes and things that have happened at Le Mans. The last year was the first official year that kicks off Le Mans Classic being an annual event instead of the whenever it can happen type of event. Having been there to see it myself, it's an amazing event. What do you think about Le Mans Classic becoming an annual? And could you see yourself going back? And if so, what would you drive? It doesn't have to be your car. It could be anybody's car. Would you participate in Le Mans Classic?
First of all, I think it's a fabulous idea. I really do. Because there are so many good race cars that are out there in some fairly competent hands. Those people, I think they want places to run those cars. And what greater place than to take it back to Le Mans. So I think it's a great idea. I don't think about things like that anymore because I don't like to think about things that I don't think will ever come true, but been involved at times with situations where things I didn't think about finally came true, So I guess if I went back, I'd want to go back in something that I'm familiar with. That's kind of my default mentality. I don't want to suggest that I'd go back and get in a modern day prototype, but I think it'd be fun to go back and drive a 935 again. I was at Monterey Rennsport a couple of years ago, and I was watching the 935s, and I noticed they looked like a 935 going in the turn. They looked like a 935 exiting the turn, but they didn't look like a 935 in the turn. Mentioned to a friend of mine who had one of the old Interscope cars there, and I told him that story about like that, and he starts laughing, and he says, what you don't realize is that all the guys that own these cars now have removed the locked rear ends and replaced them with limited slips, and they're running radial tires. So you don't have the handling characteristics in that car that you had when we drove, which you had to keep that back end slipping a little bit. You had to drive the car with passion, and you had to be gentle on it with love and care, because it would shift. It would shift from each, and that's what made them so much fun to drive. You had to horse them into a turn. You had to be on the power hard to get them turning, and then you had to manage that power out so the car would straighten up and not keep turning and go in a circle.
You mentioned not wanting to drive one of the modern cars. When you watch Le Mans, who are you rooting for?
Well, my default team is Porsche, obviously. Are they running this year or they're not?
They are not.
That's sad. I hate to see that. I think Ferrari has done an admirable job in the WEC, as the Toyota. I don't know if the Toyota's running again this year, but without Porsche, I'd probably be cheering for the Ferrari guys.
You're not going to root for Peugeot? They've had an entry since 23.
Oh, but yeah. Well, you know what? Didn't they have an entry that was it a diesel powered car back in?
Yeah, that was back during the Audi dynasty as well. Yeah, I remember the number 908. No, not 908. It would have been something else.
But that was a pretty good car, wasn't it?
Yep.
And then did they return again just prior to COVID? Was that Peugeot or was it another French team?
They came back for the 100th with the 9X8, which is their new, very slippery. It was supposed to be the fastest car down the Mulsanne. It had very little aerodynamics, which was very, very cool, but it generated downforce without all the wings. Then they ended up changing that later. We're still rooting for them. They're always there. They've been there the last 4 years now.
I guess I've lost touch a little bit on that.
It's all good.
Is WM still running the car?
No. Peugeot factory team. So, Charles, what's next for you?
Well, I have a Cayman GT4 RS that's a pretty fun car to drive out in northern New Mexico and Colorado, where the roads are a little more open and the traffic is a little less intense than the East Coast. So I like to drive that out there. I have no plans or aspirations to go racing again, to be honest with you. I'll leave that to the younger guys, because there are a lot of younger guys out there.
Do you find yourself doing any coaching or at like HPDEs or anything like that with the Porsche Club?
I went to a driver's ed deal for Porsche Club, and my weekend got short. I had a family member that passed away and I had to leave early. Yeah, that would be fun. I mean, I like mentoring younger people. Back in 75, we started a drug prevention education program, which we developed for delivery to school-age children, K through 12. We continue to do that. We've done that ever since then. I like the idea of, helping kids stay on the right track to make good decisions about their lives. So the mentoring would be a fun part of that, mentoring, coaching. I ran into a couple of kids that are doing some racing when I was at Sebring this past March. They're looking for money, they're looking for coaching, they're looking for guidance, and that's the kind of stuff that would be fun today. Yeah.
Well, with that, it's been a pleasure. But before we sign off, I want to pass the microphone to our ACO USA representative, David Lowe, for some parting thoughts.
All right.
Charles.
Yes, sir.
On behalf of the ACO and endurance racing fans everywhere, I just want to thank you for spending your evening with us. I know it was a hard battle to get you on, but you are a legend, and it was wonderful to hear your story. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, David. It's great knowing all you guys, okay?
I appreciate it. Thank you for your time. And don't be a stranger. We're going to get you back for a follow-on session.
Hey, I'm ready. I could talk about all kinds of stuff,
We look forward to it. Thank you.
Alrighty, well, thank you very much.
As we wrap up tonight's conversation, what lingers most about Charles Mendez's experience isn't just the laps he turned at Le Mans, it's the spirit he carried there. His story reminds us that the 24 hours isn't only defined by factory giants or headline victories, but by the privateers and the believers who show up with determination, ingenuity, and heart. Charles raced those long nights on the Mulsanne not for glory, but for the love of endurance racing itself. And that passion has echoed through everything he's touched since. In hearing his memories, we're reminded that legends aren't always the loudest figures in the paddock. Sometimes they're the ones who quietly shape the culture, the events, and the people around them. Charles Mendez is one of those figures, an American racer whose Le Mans chapters may be modest in number, but rich in meaning. And with that, we hope you enjoyed this presentation and look forward to more Evening with a Legend throughout the season. And on behalf of everyone here and those listening at home, thank you again, Charles, for spending your evening with us.
Thank you, Eric. Appreciate you having me.
This episode has been brought to you by the Automobile Club of the West and the ACO USA. From the awe-inspiring speed demons that have graced the track to the courageous drivers who have pushed the limits of endurance, the 24 Hours of Le Mans is an automotive spectacle like no other. For over a century, the 24 Hours Le Mans has urged manufacturers to innovate for the benefit of future motorists, and it's a celebration of the relentless pursuit of speed and excellence in the world of motorsports. To learn more about or to become a member of the ACO USA, look no further than www.lemans.org. Click on English in the upper right corner, and then click on the ACO Members tab for club offers. Once you've become a member, you can follow all the action on the Facebook group ACO USA Members Club and become part of the legend with future Evening with the Legend meetups. This episode has been brought to you by Grand Touring Motorsports as part of our Motoring Podcast Network. For more episodes like this, tune in each week for more exciting and educational content from organizations like the Exotic Car Marketplace, the Motoring Historian, Break Fix, and many others. If you'd like to support Grand Touring Motorsports and the Motoring Podcast Network, sign up for one of our many sponsorship tiers at www.patreon.com/GT Motorsports. Please note that the content, opinions, and materials presented and expressed in this episode are those of its creator, and this episode has been published with their consent. If you have any inquiries about this program, please contact the creators of this episode via email or social media as mentioned in the episode.